Howdy. Glad to greet everyone here again for another class from the BYU Library Family History Center. Today we're going to be talking about discovering your Korean War veteran. One thing I'd like to emphasize just to begin is that the military history is military history. And if you learn about military history for one war, you'll likely be very much familiar with the terminology and other things that happened in other wars. So it's not necessarily a focus on just on this war, although the content will be of the Korean War, but just bear in mind that that content applies not universally, but very, very extensively without all of the military operations that have occurred around the world and in the United States and in the colonies before that. Give a little bit of an introduction here. I was an active soldier in the Army during the Vietnam War. When I began my university studies at the University of Utah, the Vietnam War was already in progress, and I signed up to be a part of the ROTC program. I spent 4 years in the ROTC program, and as a result of that, I've always been interested that I took as many hours of military history as almost any other subject that I took for graduation at the university. So I figure I have sort of a university background in military history. And being on active duty in the Army, I went through armor school, learned how to shoot the tank guns and things, and then was assigned to military intelligence and ended up spending 2 years in Panama as a military intelligence officer for the United States Army. And as a result of that, I learned a lot more about the Army and wars after spending 2 more years studying extensively everything having to do with armies and military intelligence and understanding all of the issues that were still going on in the Vietnamese War. So at that point in time, there was a reduction in force, and as a result of that, I was discharged from the Army, and that began my rest of my life, and became an attorney for 39 years. So I'm still kind of associated, and my origins and my feelings and my emotions have a lot to do with the armies and with wars and with the battles that have been fought. And for that reason, I might mention that I may be very emotional during this particular presentation. It's probably inevitable that I will become emotional because this has very deep feelings for me is when you begin talking about veterans. We've had veterans in my family going back to my grandfather who was in World War I and also in the Border War, which is the Mexican War, and my father who served during World War II. So these are the kinds of things that are wrapped up in your families, and you may not even be aware that one of your relatives, ancestors was a Korean War veteran. So let's kind of get started here now that we've talked about it. We're going to have to think about the Korean War as the forgotten war. The United States was coming out of World War II. We were in an era of prosperity. Country was growing. People were finding jobs, and the world looked pretty good. And then we got involved in this very localized war over in Korea between North and South Korea involving China. And Basically, the people who served and the people who suffered mightily during this war were because of the conditions and because the war ended and then it was just forgotten. I mean, I doubt very seriously that you have ever heard or even haven't mentioned. I would think that you could get through all your way through high school and through college and never have had the Korean War ever discussed or ever had a class that touched on it, unless you were specifically enrolled in history classes for the 20th century and took a 20th century history class. So we need to know a little bit about it. Now, one other thing about this, just a housekeeping matter, almost every one of the slides that I have here are slides that have the link to the websites of the where these images have come from and where the websites and the information has come from. And the handout is a PDF copy of these slides, which you can get through the BYU Library Family History Center, the same way you got to the list of all the videos on the website. So if you go there, you can find the handout. If you have trouble, just contact the librarian and they can tell you how to get this. It's already been turned in. It should be available by the time this video goes up online. So now we're going to focus. The Korean War occurred between 1950 and 1953. It was 3 years long. That was 3 long years. And to orient yourself here, down at the bottom of the right of this image, you'll see Japan. And that gives you a little idea. This is the Korean Peninsula. And we have South Korea and North Korea. And the reality of it today is that the countries are still divided, that North Korea is a military dictatorship, not even too much in communist much, but it is very much allied to communist countries. And the South is a independent democracy, and they are basically the difference between the economic standpoint of the South and the North is extremely dramatic. So this is just part of what happened as a result of the war and the post-war things that occurred. And here you'll see that on June 25th, 1950, North Korean forces crossed the border with South Korea. The North Korean People's Army, the NKPA numbered approximately 135,000 men, and they went against the ROK, the Republic of Korea Army, that had 98,000 soldiers. And because it was a surprise, because it was partially anticipated and understood, but not completely, I don't think it was completely believed from the world that this would happen, but it did. And that army swept down through and almost completely captured all of South Korea before the United States and the other forces from the combined armies of mostly of Western European countries and the South Pacific countries were able to form through the United Nations forces. So this technically the armies that fought here were the combined forces of the United Nations and North Korea with their ally of communist China. These pictures, by the way, that show these statues, if you're not familiar with this, perhaps if you get a chance to go to Washington, D.C., this is, in my opinion, alongside the Vietnam War wall, and this are some of the most touching and, for me, emotional monuments in Washington, D.C. And this is really something that brings it home what was going on and what was involved. And the reason why this is so emotional for me is because of my friends and the people that I've known and had contact with that were active participants in the Korean War. And we'll talk a little bit about that as we go along. So I think it's important to understand the impact. Now, why is this something that we would want to know in genealogy? If we had 54,200 Americans who died during the hostilities, that's 54,200 people that come off of your family group sheets. Somewhere on some of your family group sheets on Family Search, there's somebody who died in Korea. And that's possible. And it's not only possible, it's probably it is statistically fairly likely that it happens to at least one of the or more of the families that you have, that they at least participated in the war, whether they were killed or not. And that was from June 27th to July 27th, 1953. And 33,700 of those were actual battle deaths, and 92,000 were wounded. And there were 8,000 missing. And South Korea sustained the brunt of all of this and had over 1.3 million casualties, including 415,000 people killed in that small country. And so this was not an insignificant part. If you were living during that time and seeing the reports and the deaths and the information that was coming, that it was truly horrific. During the Korean War and the Reconstruction period, there were 22 countries that contributed either combat forces or medical assistance. So even if you have ancestors in other countries, that's possible that you would find someone who was a Korean War veteran. So this is not an inconsiderable impact on American genealogy as such. Now, what is really important to understand is that there were 7,140 prisoners of war taken. That's from the United States. That's how many of our servicemen were captured during the Korean War and were detained. And they were not returned. There were a few prisoner exchanges, but basically some of those men stayed for the duration. If they were captured early in the war, they were there for the whole duration of the war, 3 years as a prisoner of war. And their conditions were disturbing. And of those, only 4,418 returned to the United States. 2,007 of them, one of them died as prisoners of war. You can see what percentages there were there. It was nearly 30% of the people, the prisoners of war, died, 1 out of 3. And that had a tremendous effect on those who survived. And the question were raised in those people's minds, and that have been expressed to me by people I've talked to personally, were that they could not resolve in their mind why they survived and why someone else had died. And they would just as soon have died in some cases because of the conditions they lived in for those years in the war. Now, because you need to have the continuity here, of the Korean War veterans, that would be those who fought or served during the Korean War. Not all of the veterans served in Korea. Veterans may have had other assignments outside of Korea during that time period. That's why I'm called a Vietnam era veteran instead of a Vietnam veteran, because I never actually served in Vietnam. So there were about 848,000 Korean War veterans who also served in both World War II, Vietnam, or only in World War II. 400,000 in World War II and about 273,000 who only served in Vietnam. So we had an overlap here. You had older Army personnel who had served in World War II and ended up serving in the Korean War. And you had younger Korean War veterans who stayed in the Army and ended up serving in the Vietnam War. In this overlap, you may have an ancestor who served in all three. That's possible. And so you may have military records from World War II, from the Korean War, and from the Vietnam War. So I've mentioned the POWs. This is Arden Rowley. Arden Rowley was my friend from Mesa, Arizona. And he was as they say here in his obituary, he was a father, a brother, a soldier, a teacher, a veteran, and a grandfather. He was captured by the North Koreans and partially served when the Chinese back and forth. And he wrote his experiences in a book that's called Korean POW, 1,000 Days with Life on Hold. So from 1950 to 1953, Arden was a POW in Korea. He was held for the entire duration of the war. And you can see the map of Korea with the dividing line, and up in the sort of the north part of it, you see some dots. Those are the areas where he was held captive. My wife and I knew Arden, and he came to us with the book project and wanted to have us review and publish his book. And we undertook that job. And this book, which is available online, was the product of our joint efforts in going through this and helping Arden with his book. And as a result of that, because of Arden's extreme experience here and the stories that he told and the life that he had to live for that period of time, I gained an insight and an interest in the Korean War that still affects me to this day. Now, we're going to have to kind of pull back a little bit and get into some reality here. In 1973, the National Personal Records Center, which is part of the National Archives of the United States in St. Louis, Missouri, burned, had a severe fire, and records were destroyed in that personnel fire. And no, there were no backups. But I'll explain. The records can be reconstituted, and they're being and have been reconstituted to a great extent. But this is for Army personnel discharged between November 1st, 1912 to January 1st, 1960. So you can see that 80% of the records of the personnel who served from, and you look at that, and that tells you three things. It tells you that there are records there from World War I, World War II, the Korean War, and into the actions that were starting in Southeast Asia. So you could have somebody whose records were destroyed in that. And so there's the explanation of this. This was their service records. In the Army, every person, every one of the soldiers who served in the Army, the United States Army, the Air Force, any of those of the armed forces of the United States, was given copies of all the records. In other words, the individuals were given all these records. And fortunately, in my case, my grandfather, who I never knew, who was killed in a train wreck accident before I was born, his records survived, and I have his entire records. And my father's records survived, even though he served during that time period, because I have all his records. So if your veteran kept the records, then you have access to those because they kept them. But we're going to get into some discussion here about why that's going to be a difficult thing, because just basically they don't want to talk about it. Most of the experiences were so terrible and so horrifying that they just simply refused to even talk about it or discuss it at all. And so that's kind of the situation that you're going to have. So, and not all the records were destroyed. There were some records in there, and the records have now been preserved and were once again available from the Record Center, the National Archives. This is a U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs, and in this case, it's telling that the National Personnel Records fire veterans. You can find out here if your records were destroyed, if the veteran can. Okay, so one of the catches that happens in doing military records is that the records are kept by the military organization, but they're also copies are given to the individual. But if the individual doesn't keep or maintain or loses the copies of the records, then the only way that they can get the record is for them to personally request the records. Now, this is if your veteran is already deceased and it's back in history and time, that's a different matter. But if the person is alive and you hope that and we hope that you can find some people in your family who are still alive who were veterans, and if you find one of these veterans, I would encourage you mightily to go out to spend whatever effort it takes to get some kind of a story and history of their participation, because that's going to be immensely valuable to you and to historians in the future. So basically, what we have here is a way through the Veterans Administration to begin the process of determining whether the records were destroyed and whether they're still available. Now, what are we talking about as far as numbers are concerned? As far as the numbers are concerned, we're into the situation where in 2020, there are over 1 million living Korean War era veterans. Okay, so these people are old. The median age, meaning half of them are less than 88 years old, and half of them are older than 88 years old. And most of them are in the 85 to 89-year-old age group, because that was the age of the soldiers who were drafted and ended up in the war. So this is the number of people, and they're out there, and it's important for you to understand whether or not that one or more of these of your relatives were involved in this particular war. And as you can see from the dates of the ages of these veterans, right now is almost our last chance to talk to a relative who was a Korean War veteran, and hopefully they haven't lost their memory or they're not totally incapacitated. And one of my sons-in-law, one of my daughter's husband's father, who was a veteran, has just passed away, and we are surrounded by these people, and as that says, the Korean War is the forgotten war. There's a lot of Vietnam veterans out there, some of whom are extremely vocal still, but the Korean War veterans just came home and went to work, and there wasn't any big disturbance at that time. Now, this is what I said earlier, and that is that many of the veterans refuse to talk about their terrible experiences. And this is not just something that happens occasionally. This is almost uniformly about all veterans who were active in a military way in the war, where it involved actual fighting, and people that they were associated with were getting killed, and they survived. And this is very common, but if approached and asked and encouraged, they will sometimes begin the process of kind of letting go of all these bad memories that they've had. And don't be surprised at the very terrible things that happen. When we begin the process of doing research, we need to determine what units. The armies of the world are always organized in some fashion, more or less, depending how far back you go in history. But there really are organizations, and the U.S. military and the even back into the colonial days, there was an loose organization of the military when it was primarily local volunteers. But the U.S. Army sent 9 of its divisions to Korea, and there were 300,000 troops deployed, meaning they were there in Korea. Now, one of the things you're going to find is you're going to say, well, that looks like that's a typographical error. Well, it's not a typographical error. These are quotes from Army records, and I give you the quote. That's why all of this is linked. And this is because the way the Army talks and the way that the records are kept. So you're going to find that there's a way of speaking in the Army and a way of referring to their units. Now, the important thing to understand about this is that the people who have been involved directly in these operations and were career Army people have a very great interest in the history of their units. And some of these units, like some of the infantry divisions and the others, were divisions that fought in World War I and World War II. And so they have a history and they go back. And some of them even go back to the Civil War. So if you start to get into military history, then you're going to find that you are actually looking at the division and unit histories. And all I can say is you'll probably end up being amazed how many records and how many histories of Army and all the other Navy, Air Force, Marines, all of the different divisions of our military, how many histories there are. And this is, by the way, totally outside of anything that has to do with genealogy. So the genealogy programs, perhaps with the exception of the ancestry program that we'll talk about, Fold 3, is probably the only one that has any kind of depth of records in the sense of these unit histories, the histories of each unit. Now we're going to talk about where the basic records came from. And it's going to be a little bit different as you go way back in history, if you go back into like the Civil War history, because those records are going to be kept at like the National Archives. And so the National Archives, you're going to have to deal with the records from the National Archives, but these are still records coming from the National Archives. And this is a military request form. So once the veteran has a desire to get his or her military service record, then this is, and it's okay. Now, I haven't mentioned this, but it's extremely important to understand that there was a significant number of women who served in the military and served in Korea. There were a lot of nurses. There were a lot of people who were adjunct at that time. They were not involved directly in combat, but they got involved in combat because they got overrun or they had difficulties that were caused by combat. So this is how the individual veteran applies for the records. How you get access to the records is by going through the process of getting the records from the National Archives. So you are going to have to go to the National Archives website, and you will find a section on the military records, which I think I have a link to. So here's the documents that you need to have for the service of a U.S. veteran of a war. These are the generalized documents. First of all, these are links to the places where these kinds of documents are explained. So this is a website that will help you understand and obtain the documents. And then there's the U.S. Military Directory. This will help you understand where the units might be. Even if your veterans' records were destroyed in the St. Louis fire of the National Personnel Center, you're very likely that their unit records were kept someplace else. And so the unit records could be almost as detailed and almost have as much information as the personnel file. It would just be a lot more records to go through to find the individual references to the individual soldier. And filling out this form is to obtain an authentication. You have to authenticate to see if an individual had served in the military. But this is something directly for that person's particular documentation. So a lot of times this issue comes up when a veteran who fought in a war, who hasn't maintained any particular contact with any kind of a military organization and simply walked away from, when they were discharged, walked away and made their life away from the Army, and now is in his or her old age and needs help from the veterans, from a veteran hospital, or needs veteran benefits. They want to go back to school. They want to take advantage of some veterans' opportunities. And in that case, they're going to have to go through this process of requesting and getting the documentation. So it's possible when you contact a relative who has been through the war that you will need to guide them through this process. In other words, say, grandpa, uncle, whoever, aunt, that this is what you need to do to get your records. And they may not be happy to do that, but if they want the veteran services, then they're going to need to do this. And so here's another explanation of how you look up a veteran's official military personnel file. And these the records go back to the beginning of the country. There's similar kinds of records, lists of records. For example, in the records that do exist, every unit in the Army, Air Force, Marines, all of those people, has to file a daily report when they're in a battle, when they're in a military confrontation situation. They need to know how many people are available to serve on any given day. So if people are sick, or if they're, whatever, they have been detailed someplace else, or they're not available, then they may not be available for service. And so every day the general, or the whoever was the colonel, or whoever's in charge of the military unit, is responsible to have his staff collect records every day, and each unit is required to give a daily status report. So when you go back through Revolutionary War veterans, you go back through Civil War veterans, you go back through Spanish-American War veterans, you're going to find out that there's these daily records of everybody that was serving and who was available and who wasn't available. And in putting that together with the actual history of the unit, then you can tell what the unit was doing. So you know what your ancestor was doing in a given period of time, what battles they may have been fighting in, and what was going on. Because if they show up in the day report as being ready for battle, for service, then they were out there on the line shooting. And if they were injured and they were in a hospital, then they were there. So that's sort of the way they look. Now, this is just kind of a general instruction. This is kind of overall, if you're used to watching these kinds of presentations, you might want to realize this. When you're watching the presentation and one of these links shows up on the screen, then stop the video and copy the link out if you want to look at the link. That's the simplest way to get the links out of all these videos. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning, there is a PDF copy of this that you can obtain from the library when the video is finally published sometime later this next week, usually by Thursdays. So now we're going to talk a little bit about some of the other websites that might be available for records. Ancestry started this website, and it's called Fold3. And the name is kind of, if you're familiar with military, that makes a lot of sense. But if you're not, it seems kind of strange. And what it means is that this is the way that the flags are folded. And I have a flag that was presented because of my father being a veteran to me at the time of my father's funeral, and it is a triangular shaped fold of a flag, and we have it in a triangular shaped box container for it with glass so we can see the flag. And so this is something that veterans who are actually veterans of the military, who have served enough time to qualify, are entitled to. There's lots of benefits from being a veteran, and not quite enough to pay for the time and the effort if you've managed to serve all 3 years of the war as a prisoner of war. But Fold3 is a subscription website. It's not free as a family search partner website. It is separate from Ancestry.com, but you will from time to time see links from Ancestry.com to Fold3. Now, as I mentioned about the National Archives, there are specific instructions for research in the National Archives of military records research. I would suggest that you might want to make some kind of significant effort to find the military records, and depending on how far you want to go in finding records before you start working with the National Archives, because it's going to take you a considerable effort and time, particularly time at the particular National Archives branch or in Washington, D.C., depending on where those are served, or at the Personnel Center in St. Louis, to obtain the records. And that, as I kind of put here, good luck. It is a very long process. It has not been expedited in any way. One of the records that's surprising is that veterans are entitled to receive either burial in a national cemetery or a headstone, or both. In other words, if you're buried in a national cemetery, then you receive a headstone. But if you're not buried in a national cemetery, your veteran can still apply for, or his family, once they're deceased, can apply for a headstone. Now, one thing about this is my grandfather's record on his service. And basically, if you look at this record and you look at it carefully, it looks like it's pretty messy. It's been stricken over and things written around the margin and everything. And what's interesting about this is that not only does it give some basic information about my grandfather, but it also has a summary of his entire military service. And that's that stuff that is in red that runs around the edge of the record. So this is an alternate record that happened to have the information complete information about where and when he served in the military. And we had nothing from the family. Well, it was kind of in the situation where, since he was killed while he was quite young, as a young man, not young man, but in his 40s, it was really probably, if he'd lived, he was always active in veterans organizations, and we would have had a lot more stories and stuff about him being both in the border war with Pancho Villa and Patton and all those people down there. And I mentioned United States military unit histories. These are absolutely as detailed as you can. They're almost a day-by-day account in some cases. Sometimes not, sometimes others are. But you cannot comprehend how many there are. Usually the larger armed force bases, whether it's an Air Force base or an Army base, or if it's one of the academies, all of these have libraries. All of them have museums. Not all, but many of them have libraries, and many of them have museums. And many of those museums and libraries have these histories. And they may not be available anyplace else. So you may have to track down someplace that, once you know the unit, then you have to find out where the unit's historical headquarters was, which branch. So if it was an infantry unit, was it at Fort Benning in Georgia, which, by the way, the name is changing at some point in time. So here's another website that is basically helping an official Defense Department website that tells another way and gives instructions on obtaining the records from the National Archives. And I mentioned that veterans could be buried in a national cemetery. So we have the National Cemetery Administration, and there is a National Cemetery Locator. And it's a part of this website. It's the grave locator. And you can look for and see if you can find a grave for your ancestor in any of the national military cemeteries. This is the gravesite locator. So if you click on this, then you can see there's search options for searching for a gravesite. One other possibility in each of the wars there's a Korean War Veterans Association, there's a Vietnam Veterans Association. Every war has its Veterans Association, or had. The Veterans Administration for those who fought in the Civil War was very active for many, many years. Of course, all the Civil War veterans have now deceased, and so that organization no longer exists, but the records of the Civil War Veterans Administration are extensive. This is the monument at the Korean War Memorial in Washington, D.C., and it's a reminder of the price that was paid by these soldiers to help to maintain at least a partial amount of freedom in a part of the world where these men did not know who the people they were defending and never did get to meet to learn much about them, usually, and still were there to give their lives. Okay, well, thanks for watching.